Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There is a wide acceptance that we have drifted too far away from nature and that we need to pull closer. Many have called for 30 by 30, conserving 30% of nature by 2030. The 2022 State of the Birds report pointed out that more than half of bird species normally found in habitats as diverse as forests, deserts, and oceans in the United States are in decline. Climate change is a major factor in those declines, but human development also plays a key role by chewing into wildlife habitat and creating biological islands. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. How do we reverse declines in wildlife and in wildlife habitat? Can we prevent Yellowstone, Yosemite, Kings Canyon, Rocky Mountain National Parks, and other large western landscape parks from turning into biological islands? Today, we're going to explore the problems and possible solutions with Elaine Leslie, who was the National Park Service's Chief for Biological Resources before retiring, and Bart Melton, who leads the National Parks Conservation Association's Wildlife Program. We'll be back in a minute with Elaine and Bart.
The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the national park system for decades to come. You can see their successes at gtnpf.org. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at wnpf.org. The Everglades Foundation, the only organization whose sole mission is to restore and protect America's Everglades. Learn more at evergladesfoundation.org.
Well, welcome to the Traveler, Elaine and Bart.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
You know, this is a topic that is gaining more and more attention. How do we preserve wildlife habitat? Can we preserve it? Can we create migratory corridors for species that allows them to gain more habitat and also to exchange genetics and avoid genetic bottlenecks? There's a short history of migratory corridors. We've had the Wildlands Network, which has been working since 1991 to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America, as they put it. And then there's the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which since 1993 has been working to build a corridor from Yellowstone to the Yukon Territory in Canada. Have these projects been successful at all? Are we seeing progress in improving migratory habitat?
I think absolutely. I mean, these are not new concepts by any means. Connectivity is a critical piece of how we're going to restore and maintain biodiversity. Reed Noss, was such a brilliant person when it came to this and really used connectivity corridors in a landscape design level. And I think a lot of work that's been done in Florida and in the South is evident of that. He was also working on some of the areas in the Rockies and in California and along the Pacific coast as well. So what Jody Hilty and her team have done in the Y2Y initiative has certainly served as a model, and how cooperative collaboration when it comes to conservation can indeed work. Is it solving all the issues and the problems? No, not at all, but it's certainly making a dent in what those issues are. And I think the more we have those kind of initiatives, and there's plenty of them out there, and I would also say, don't forget about the air. You talked about avian species, and using tools such as MODIS to provide safe pathways for birds, and also look at like I said, the oceans, ancient pathways that have been used by marine mammals and sharks and fish. We need to remember those sort of things as well. It's not just land-based ungulates that need this. It's not just charismatic megafauna. And I think that's what Y2Y and other initiatives have exhibited, that this can work for species like grizzly bear and wolverines and bobcat and mountain lion and the whole predator-prey relationship.
Sure, and we'll get into some of the trickle down to other species, but again, to why, what successes can we point to? I know they've been acquiring land and doing easements since 1993, but are we actually seeing wildlife take up that corridor, take advantage of the corridor that has been constructed?
Yeah, I can't speak to the success of any individual effort across a space that large, but I think what's notable is the on-the-ground successes that are occurring across that Yellowstone to Yukon landscape. And really only speak to the U.S. side of the border from NPCA's perspective, but there's great community-driven conservation occurring throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and in the crown of the continent. You have everything from collaboration between conservation organizations, community members, and landowners to remove and alter fencing for pronghorn migration, seasonally opening up historic range that hasn't seen pronghorn in decades or more. You have efforts like the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes working to improve habitat connectivity by reducing wildlife vehicle collision south of Glacier, and dozens of other examples of local communities coming together, working across federal agencies, private landowners, and members of the tribal community, all working together to come up with solutions around connectivity so wildlife can continue to move across a really unique landscape in the world. And from a parks perspective, that's really important for the wildlife in Yellowstone. It's really important for the wildlife at Glacier. And there's other examples around the country of those types of kind of locally driven and in some ways state and federally supported efforts that are really exciting. And we're happy to see that change from the bottom up. And there's some great change occurring at the federal level too, which we can talk about.
Yeah, I do believe if you do go north of the border into Canada, up around Banff National Park, they have found that wildlife crossings over the Trans-Canadian Highway has improved genetic connectivity for black and grizzly bears. So that's one thing we can point to. Recently, and this is a small migratory corridor, we saw the launch in California, or the groundbreaking of a wildlife overpass over the 101 freeway. And, obviously part of that was pushed by, it's awful tough for a mountain lion to cross 10 lanes of traffic. And the other is to not only allow them to cross 10 lanes of traffic, but hopefully bring in new genetics to the population around the Santa Monica Mountains.
Right. I mean, I think if there's any legacy of P22, it's that more people understand the importance of top predators and their ability to move, right? And I think that overpass has been 20 years in the making and really started with a lot of the work that Dr. Paul Beyer out of Northern Arizona University did in the Santa Ana Mountains and the Chino Hills down by Santa Monica to bring awareness to the importance of these passages, these crossings. And overpasses, while not, necessarily a corridor, they do provide some linkages to get to some better habitat. And that just wasn't the lions. I mean, you could see the coyotes, you could see the bear in the pictures, there's a whole number of species that have been using some of the larger culverts, and that have those that didn't got hit by cars on the 101. So we certainly are looking forward to the completion of this and other overpasses. There's one that's just not far from my house on the 160, but mainly for ungulates that we've seen use that, and a few smaller, the mesocarnivores. But there's great ones. I think it's Highway 93, right? If I'm not mistaken, has a lot of evidence of animals using these. And so all of that contributes to the movement, the ability for these animals to move, to roam, for that purpose of genetic diversity and to avoid interbreeding. But also, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that we have the habitat necessary. So not just a corridor, but a necessary habitat that's big enough for animals to roam, that big enough for animals to escape climate change impacts. With increasing climates rising and more, I'd say, disaster type events, animals have to be able to move away from some of this too. You've got the invasion of weeds, you've got invasion of other exotic species. So these patches, these linkages, these connectivity corridors need to be big enough to move. I mean, we talk about parks not being big enough. I think it was George Wright back in the 30s who made the first awareness that, oh my God, these parks we're creating are not nearly big enough to maintain species, and especially migratory species, and allow for the necessary biodiversity that needs to be retained in these areas and beyond. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's good work being done, but there's a lot more we can do.
I'm wondering, we talk about biological islands, we talk about these migratory corridors to improve genetic dispersal. Do either one of you know of any studies that raise some alarm over wildlife genetics in the national park system because of lack of new genes? I mean, obviously we have Isle Royale National Park with the wolves there. That's kind of a unique situation because it's on an island that you need an ice bridge in the wintertime. But, looking at places like Yellowstone or Rocky Mountain or, Zion National Park, any evidence that we're starting to run into genetic problems at those or other parks?
I'll chime in here, but I would just say, I always worry about the Florida panther situation and what's happening in the Everglades and South Florida, all the way up the coast and into Texas. Those are more or less some hybrid animals that, that they think they've sort of got a handle on what's going on. But I was going to bring up the Isle wolf issue because that is a pretty classic example of what happened.
The Isle Royale wolf?
Isle Royale wolves, yeah. That's a pretty classic example of what can happen. And then the efforts and the money that it takes to get back to a good place, which they are getting there.
Well, there's the individual examples, and then there's the long-term concern. And I think from NPCA's perspective, something we are thinking a lot about, along with our conservation partners, is sort of the dual threat of climate change and development long term. Habitat fragmentation and climate change are driving what is now referred to as a global biodiversity crisis. Scientists are predicting current levels of habitat loss and impacts from climate change could lead to 40% of species being lost globally by the end of the century. And so there's the near-term impacts to populations, and I think some great localized examples that Elaine highlighted, but also planning for the scale of the challenge we're facing, I think requires some sort of longer term thinking. And also, it's a concern about multiple generations of wildlife and sort of where we'll be at the end of this century and what we're leaving for our children and grandchildren. And really, national parks are no exception to the impacts of climate change and development, as we're talking about park biodiversity, everything from not just wildlife, but plants, aquatic species, really entire ecosystems as we know them are threatened. And so connectivity is one of those solutions to addressing those problems. But I think it's important to say, what are those individual issues that really have created a lack of connectivity, have cut off traditional migration corridors? And we've pinpointed some of them, but I think it's important to sort of look at the whole picture and think about not only park adjacent road systems and a lack of connectivity there as a result, but also human development from subdivisions, fencing, energy development from renewables and oil and gas, new hard rock mines like the one we're dealing with that's proposed next to Gates of the Arctic in Alaska, and more. There's just lots of development occurring right up on the edges of parks. And that combined with the impacts of climate change, more extreme wildfires, extreme weather events, drought, the flooding we saw at Yellowstone this year could certainly fall into that category of extreme weather events. Massive temperature variations and trends. When those two combine, it's of course the threatened and endangered species we're worried about seeing recover today and the impacts they're feeling, but it's healthier populations of wildlife that over the next few generations could see severe impacts from that sort of dual threat of development and climate change that we're really concerned about. And I think why it takes sort of a community approach and not only just a Park Service, but a federal agency, federal family-wide approach to addressing the challenge and the need to work with tribes, local communities, willing private landowners adjacent to parks and other federal lands, and come together around some thoughtful solutions to the challenges that we're facing on the horizon, and they're unfolding today.
This is Kurt Repenchuk. We're talking today with Elaine Leslie and Bart Melton from National Park Conservation Association. Elaine Leslie was Park Service's Chief for Biological Resources. We're talking about wildlife habitat and migratory corridors and how we can possibly enhance wildlife habitat and along the way bolster genetic diversity. We'll be right back after a short break.
Listener and reader support make National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation via nationalparkstraveler.org. The Yosemite Conservancy helps visitors connect with Yosemite through adventures, volunteering, and the arts. It's the only nonprofit dedicated to supporting Yosemite National Park and funds grants to improve trails, restore habitat, protect wildlife, and inspire the next generation of nature lovers. Learn more at yosemite.org. Interior Federal Credit Union offers a large suite of savings products, including secondary savings accounts for budgeting, individual retirement accounts, health savings accounts, education savings accounts, money marketing accounts, and certificates. Start the new year off with an account at Interior Federal Credit Union and get ready for all the adventures 2023 has to offer. Not a member yet? Go to interiorfcu.org and click on the membership icon on the homepage. Federally insured by NCUA. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with a breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com. Potrero group.com.
Okay, we're back with Elaine and Bart. There have been a handful of reports out recently about the problem with biological islands and how we can solve those problems. The Pew Charitable Trust came out with one last October discussing the need for creating migratory corridors and the challenges standing in the way. The U.S. Geological Survey just released a report on ungulate corridors in the West. And a team of researchers led by William Newmark at the Utah Museum of Natural History also just released a study outlining how connections between Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks and Mount Rainier and North Cascades National Parks could greatly expand wildlife habitat and expand populations. Now, I'm curious, Bart, you just mentioned all the various stakeholders we've got involved here, different federal agencies, private landowners, state agencies. Just looking at the federal agencies, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, I guess we could also throw in there U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they all have different missions. I mean, can we get them all on the same page in the recognition of the value of migratory corridors and working together to see that they are created?
Yes, I think we can. But, in this case, I don't think the federal agencies can do it alone. They have to collaborate with states. They have to work with private landowners and importantly, need to work with tribes too in a new and different way. The great news is there's a lot that's happening and has already happened that I think is critically important steps from a policy perspective that are really notable in recent years. First up, this is a bipartisan issue, which makes it a problem we can solve together because we already are. During the Trump administration, then Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke signed Secretarial Order 3362, which directed the Department of Interior agencies to work with 11 different Western states to conserve winter range migration corridors for mostly game species, mostly ungulates, pronghorn, elk, mule deer. But this has led to a comprehensive improvement of our understanding of ungulate migrations in the West. You mentioned the USGS study. That's a direct result of that effort. Secretary Holland, under President Biden, is committed to continue investments in that effort, and they have done so with the release of the new report. But there's a lot more that the administration and Congress has done that I think is worth noting. The administration recommended the expansion of collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitats and corridors in their Conserving and Restoring America the Beautiful report. That's the sort of overarching statement of intent for the Biden administration. And a lot of that's a carryover from what we saw with Secretarial Order 3362, but hopefully going bigger, thinking of more species, thinking about the rest of the country and the territories. They've also committed to improve wildlife corridors in President Biden's Build Back Better plan, in the president's budget for fiscal year 22. Corridors and connectivity are mentioned throughout. But there's some really important things that have happened that I think we can't have this conversation without noting. One is the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which included access to billions to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions through mitigation efforts. That's strategic fencing, overpasses, underpasses. The legislation for the first time specifically established a pilot $350 million grant program for wildlife vehicle collision reduction for federal agencies, tribes, and states to apply for project-specific support. The last Congress also passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides critical dollars for the Park Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, that they can use to support improved connectivities and corridor conservation over the next decade. Importantly, USDA also received dollars through that legislation that can be used to support voluntary private landowner conservation efforts. This is a lot of wonky sounding sort of things, but what it amounts to is a turning of the ship, I think, to some degree, the slow turning of the federal ship towards this issue of connectivity and corridors, and a collaborative approach to it, because this isn't just about the federal agencies. This is about all the partners that need to come together. All the pieces are there, and I think the administration has a real opportunity to take all this and point it in the right direction and start to address this sort of dual threat of development and climate change in relation to wildlife conservation in national parks and more broadly across the United States and North America. There's one other thing I would flag, and that's the agencies are starting to take specific steps under this administration too. The Bureau of Land Management, which manages a lot of land adjacent to National Park Service managed lands around the West, recently released a habitat connectivity memo, an instructional memo for agency-wide instructional memo that directs planning and on-the-ground management actions, conservation and restoration efforts to ensure areas remain intact and healthy to support diverse wildlife and plant populations. So lots of actions on corridors, but I guess to actually get to your question, Kurt, can we do more? Yes, and I think we've been thinking through some very specific steps we'd like to see federal agencies take in the coming years to do more on this issue, because we've got a lot of work to do. But the good news is we are doing something.
Well, I'm curious about policy because, you mentioned former Interior Secretary Zinke. He was in favor of grizzly recovery in the North Cascades complex, and then his successor, former Interior Secretary David Bernhardt, said, "No, I don't want it. The local communities don't want it. We're going to shut it down." And so I'm just wondering, you mentioned a lot of the money flowing through the current administration's policies, the Build Back Better and the Infrastructure Reduction Act. The new slim Republican majority in the House of Representatives, wants to cut back spending. And do we need to hardwire through legislation the policy of enhancing wildlife habitat so that one administration can't cancel what the past administration did, and so we're just ping-ponging back and forth?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this has been a bipartisan issue, but we are advocating for a comprehensive solution long-term. NPCA supported, along with many partners, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act in the last Congress, and that was comprehensive corridors-focused legislation that did pass out of the House. And that was notable progress. That legislation in some way, shape, or form has been floating around since 2014, 2015. And so making it out of the House last year was real progress. As that effort has slowly worked its way forward, 9 states have passed corridors legislation, and many others have dedicated funding to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. Many tribes have now passed their own resolutions or policies that are working to address the problem across the U.S. So there is this slow sort of shift occurring with states like Florida and California right out front on wildlife corridors conservation being addressed through legislation. We'll continue to push for that this Congress. I think it remains to be seen what that opportunity is, but we'll be looking for bipartisan support for that. And, folks like Don Beyer of Virginia really have been pushing that for years. And I think we owe a lot of credit to those that have been sort of quietly pushing this forward in Congress for almost a decade now. That said, there are some policy changes that are pretty basic that we would like to see addressed through Congress, and we think there's an opportunity for the administration to address. One is identification of wildlife corridors. We're doing great work, I think, as a country on the ungulate identification. That new USGS report is a fantastic read, amazing information in there, so much to learn. We have a lot more to learn as a country, and we have a great agency with USGS that can partner with states and tribes and others to help get that done. The protection and management of wildlife corridors and connectivity. There's a lot of existing agency authority to manage, protect, and restore wildlife corridors and to support tribes and private landowners in that work. And we'd love to see more of that. And something that the federal agencies can do, you raised that earlier, Kurt, sort of what does collaboration look like? How are these federal agencies working together? We're recommending, and the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act recommended, the establishment of a formal cross-departmental interagency management body for federal natural resource managers to work with relevant regional governments, tribal leaders, state wildlife authorities to collaborate on the protection and restoration of corridors and connectivity around parks, of course, but also nationwide. And we're also recommending more funding, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant opportunity to take existing dollars and invest them today in that. So yes, we need a lasting solution, but we also have a lot of opportunity with the current administration based on the actions of previous administrations too, sort of rally around this issue and really work on the problem.
Elaine, we're going to take a short break, but I want to come back to you after the break about successes that we're seeing across the national parks. This is Kurt Repenchek. We're talking today with Elaine Leslie, who was the National Park Service's Chief for Biological Resources before retiring, and Bart Melton, who leads the National Parks Conservation Association's Wildlife Program. We'll be back in a minute.
Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smoky's Life is a biannual magazine produced by Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokiesinformation.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
Okay, we're back talking about wildlife habitat, migration corridors, bottlenecks, and successes. And Elaine, I'm curious, Bill Newmark, who I mentioned earlier from the Utah Museum of Natural History, back in 1995, he came out with a report that looked at the loss of wildlife that had been native in national parks originally before the parks were created. And he looked at the losses of wildlife that we had seen because these parks had either turned into biological islands or we wanted to drive them out, so to speak. We didn't want to share the landscape with those parks. And some of the numbers were pretty extraordinary in terms of percentage of mammalian wildlife that was lost. In some places, 25%, parks like Yosemite and Bryce Canyon and Zion. Have we seen progress in recovering some of those species, some of those native species that were forced out?
Sure, and I think Joel Berger came up with another paper, I think that was in the mid-'80s, maybe early '90s, that sort of did a lot of number calculating on the amount of species that have been lost and where is our National Park Service priority at restoration of species. And that was a good paper as well to have a read at. But yes, I think we're making great progress. It's probably not as fast as I'd like to see it. And generally it's because funding and time and capacity is very limited when it comes to species restoration. And you need to not look at just species restoration, but you need to look at habitat restoration. You don't want to put something back into something that's of lesser quality and they're not going to be able to make a go of it in perpetuity. But you can't go to Grand Canyon or now maybe the Redwoods or Zion and look at a condor flying and not be in awe that we brought this thing back. And was that a National Park Service effort alone? Absolutely not. It was states, it was zoos, it was a myriad of organizations that did that. So it's not just a matter of a park going and saying, oh, I'm going to bring back this species. It takes a lot of people and a lot of energies. I think Rainier has done a great job. Chip Jenkins was there. He's at Grand Tetons now, but multiple mesocarnivore species are back there. Yosemite has had great success. So there's a lot going on out there, but it's slow because there's compliance and there's funding and there's lack of staff to carry out these initiatives. But that's what we'd like to see. I think in every region, an action plan that looks at the restoration of at-risk species, but combined with that, not only the restoration of those species, but ensuring their habitat is quality habitat, working with your neighbors to ensure that they have the amount of room they need to persist. And that whole compounded thing of looking at climate change and what's going to be able to be maintained in that particular park. And then what Bart was saying, looking at sprawl outside of parks. It's pretty huge. I think that's almost more impacting than not having some of these designated corridors or lines on a map right now. If you look, especially what's going on outside of Yellowstone or Grand Canyon or other places. But yes, I think we've made progress. The National Park Service itself, under John Jarvis, we had the call to action, and we had a whole action item on making sure parks were aware and the public was aware. It's called There and Back Again. It was about migratory species and knowing what's in your park that is a migratory species and working with others to ensure its migration and its path is successful there and back again. And that was successful and has now morphed into Connected Conservation, a program within the National Park Service. But what I'd like to also see is that every region in the National Park Service has a conservation biologist. And that conservation biologist can be in the region or in the learning centers, which would be great too, to have those as a productive centerpiece for this sort of dialogue. But we used to have science advisors in every region for the regional director. And I don't think we have one anymore. The last couple are now gone. But so what can that morph into? But a landscape conservation biologist would be a great start. And I think there's a couple regions that are really making some good moves toward this. But I think it's something that needs to be ingrained in the National Park Service and really come up with some strategies and visions for the future in those particular regions. And there's a lot that parks can do and are doing as well. We can talk about in a minute.
Yeah, I think this could be a 3-part or a 4-part series. And of course, there's the resiliency of some of these species. I mean, you mentioned Mount Rainier, and of course, we've seen wolverines return there and breed in recent years. We've heard of wolverines going from the Yellowstone ecosystem down to the Uintas in northern Utah, which kind of surprises me. I'd like to see that. And of course, we had the case of the gray wolf from the Yellowstone ecosystem show up on the Grand Canyon, the north rim of the Grand Canyon. So obviously, they have the desire to move. They want to expand their territories, so to speak. Looking at California, we've got some great national parks there: Yosemite, Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Lassen. I could go on and on and on. There was a proposal recently to create a range of light national monument between Yosemite National Park and Kings Canyon National Park by basically transferring, I guess, the bulk of the Sierra National Forest over to the Park Service. Is that needed to enhance the connectivity, the wildlife habitat between those two parks?
I don't know that it would enhance it, other than I don't know the percentage of logging that occurs in the Forest Service lands there. Maybe Bart does. Is it a great step? Yes. Will it happen? I doubt it. I don't have a lot of faith in that. Would it be a terrific linkage and ability for wildlife and species to be restored in that? I think the Forest Service should not be dismissed as doing good work as well. And there's a lot of challenges with being in the Forest Service versus being with the Park Service that has a lot of policies and a lot of great tools legislated to us to be able to do preservation of habitat and restoration of species and habitat. So I don't know if that will happen. It would be nice, but I think we also need to perfect example of working with your neighbors, working with the other federal agencies, dive into the state action plans if you're a Park Service person, have a presence at some of these discussions, and then come to the table and see what you can both put on the table for collaborative conservation when it comes to these areas, so that you do have seamless management in some areas. You're not always going to have it in every area, but I think you can come to the table and agree on some.
We can hope. Now, Bart, I'm curious. Migratory corridors, some of them are going to stretch hundreds of miles. I don't know how wide they would have to be, anywhere from 2 miles to 30 miles or 40 miles perhaps. You're going to be crossing a lot of roads. It costs to build overpasses and underpasses. Any guesstimate of how much money we're talking to make these things a reality, and where that money would come from?
Well, I think the last transportation reauthorization bill that I mentioned before is a good start for us as a country to start to wrap our arms around this issue. And we're hopeful that that funding will support state and federal agencies engaging not just in mitigation, but in studies, much like the mapping of corridors and connectivity and the need for better understanding, like we're seeing the great document I referenced out of USGS earlier on ungulates in the West. That kind of improved hard science to inform decision making is critical. And I think before we rush to do overpasses and underpasses everywhere, we know some places where we need, an improved culvert here or maybe an overpass there. one, there's a lot of opportunity to integrate wildlife vehicle collision mitigation into things like bridge replacement, like we're seeing between Great Smoky Mountains and adjacent national forest and the Pigeon River Gorge on Interstate 40 right now. And that's being driven by good hard science, understanding how animals are moving through that space. We need that level of science to inform decision-making on infrastructure investments, but also it doesn't have to be a standalone project. It can be part of how we build roads in the country over time. But we've got a lot to learn. I think we know we have a problem, and in some places we understand that problem better than others. And hopefully we'll learn as we go. But we've committed to do a lot of infrastructure investment, and I hope that state transportation agencies will work with federal land managers and their state fish and game agency partners and tribes to understand what those problems look like in their backyard. But we've got a lot of work to do, no doubt.
Any concerns about societal opposition? I mean, you can go back to the 70s and the 80s with the shoot, shovel, and shut up. We don't want a threatened or endangered species anywhere close to our property. You've got situations with urban sprawl that laps over into wildlife habitat, and all of a sudden grizzly bears are showing up in backyards in Jackson Hole and West Yellowstone, or cougars are showing up even where I live in northern Utah. Moose are showing up, elk are showing up, and some people don't like that. Is that going to be a major impediment to some of these migratory corridors? I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the grizzly bear recovery program for North Cascades Complex was shut down in part because of local opposition.
Yeah, the good news is the grizzly bear recovery effort seems to be back on its feet and out for public comment. So we're hopeful on North Cascades grizzly restoration. But I think it's easy in these conversations to focus in on the tough decisions we have to make. Like, if you live next to Yellowstone and you have bison between you and your car when you walk out to take your kids to school, bison are tough neighbors. So there's certainly a community level conversation that needs to be had about how that animal's moving through the landscape and how you're managing that as a community. And that's multiple people coming together to figure that out. But I think there's a whole other side to this, which is the issue of aquatic connectivity. We have culverts that are dilapidated, that are cutting off salmon migrations and trout migrations. We have salamander populations that might have a much shorter migration, but are no less important. And around the country, we've got a lot to learn about how development, not only within parks, but adjacent to parks, impacts the long-term health of species. And I think, if anything, I'd like to think that people who live next to Grand Teton or are at Acadia in Maine as their backyard care about those spaces and care about the wildlife and are willing to come to the table and to come up with solutions that make sense to protect those spaces.
Elaine, I'd be curious, over your career, I'm sure that you sat in more than a few meetings over wildlife issues with local populations. What's your sense of society's position on migratory corridors and open up their backyards potentially to bears or elk or bison?
Well, I think there are some communities that certainly do it and do it well, and have great education programs to help people make it through those things. I live in Durango, and there's a great, Be Bear Smart program that allows people to ensure they can enjoy the natural world around them that they've moved into, but also protect the wildlife. I mean, and that's a very critical thing. I think Bart mentioned it before, though, that there is opposition to a federally designated corridor. Because it's kind of along the lines of, do we need another federally protected land that, the government's controlling, that sort of thing. So I think through education and really working with communities, we can make it through some of those obstacles, but it takes a lot of effort. And I really believe that national parks are anchors for these linkages, like you were talking about, just, whether it's the path of the pronghorns emanating from Grand Tetons, or that wolverine that made it all the way from Grand Tetons, went through Rocky and crossed I-70. How do we work better with the people along the way to make sure that they understand that, wildlife are not necessarily second-class stakeholders in this thing, that we need to make them a priority if we're going to continue to enjoy not only our public lands, whether on a federal, state, or community level, but as a whole, as a vision, as this piece of trying to better understand global biodiversity and how to restore and retain that. If we can't live with our coyote friend across the road, then are we living that well with our neighbor next door? I don't know.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, but one other topic I wanted to get in before we said goodbye. Down species benefits. I mean, we're talking about climate change and enhancing habitat, for, large mammalian species. But there's also got to be some down species benefits through this as well, aren't there?
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing Y2Y and some of the Florida initiatives have really shown is that, the science behind monitoring some of these underpasses and overpasses and these corridors prove that, it's not just the ungulate, that is benefiting. It's the whole predator-prey relationship, but also it gives those mesocarnivores and others the ability to move as well. I mean, I'm not sure what paper it was in today. It might have been the Washington Post or the New York Times, but it just showed some camera traps. And it was kind of interesting because the whole premise of the story showed, turkeys and bears and, deer and whatever. And it was interesting because it showed that some of these corridors or linkages that might be too small are ushering in conflicts with species that wouldn't normally come into contact with each other. So that's an interesting aspect as well. As if you can get a grizzly bear to move through someplace, you can get whatever else, the wolverine or the smaller mesocarnivores, et cetera, to be able to move through that too. But you also have to be cognizant that there could be these other kinds of conflicts created.
Sure. But I think those corridors also open up the possibility for vegetation that needs to move to a higher elevation, perhaps because of climate change.
And also, when it comes to vegetation, noxious weeds and non-native species also have the ability to move through these, whether they're flora or fauna. And so paying attention to what we're doing. I mean, if you have increased climate change, increased hotter, warmer, sometimes wetter, you're going to see some of these species move through and make really unusable habitat to some degree.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's another angle, I think in the lower 48, especially in some of the territories, we're thinking a lot about restoration of connectivity, maintenance of connectivity, sort of dealing with development and other threats. And it's interesting, NPCA's work in Alaska with our tribal partners there and others is a little different because our work there is to maintain solidly existing connected spaces on the map, be it the Pebble Mine or the recently proposed 210-mile long Ambler Road at Gates of the Arctic, which 20 miles of that road would cut through the preserved portion of the Gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve, and it would open up a whole new hard rock mining district in Northwest Alaska. And the implications of that are huge. The Western Arctic caribou herd is the second largest land migration on Earth. It covers the distance annually of, I think, Miami to Seattle across that small little corner of Alaska up there. So I forget just how large that state is. But caribou have shown that they're extremely susceptible to disturbance, specifically roads. And we'd basically be cutting their annual migration in half with a 210-mile road, opening up a new mining district, and really impacting native communities that enjoy and want to maintain their subsistence lifestyle beyond park borders, but the park and preserve is part of their subsistence sort of cultural right and heritage. And so we have lots of conversations to have in the lower 48, but we also have some important conversations to have in Alaska about how our decision making can impact ecosystems that are, for all intents and purposes, intact. So I think connectivity isn't just a Wyoming issue. It's not just a Florida issue. It's an Alaska issue too.
Yeah. Well, Bart and Elaine, it's been great having you for this discussion today. A lot of provocative topics to consider and issues to try and figure out. And hopefully down the road, we'll have some success stories to talk about.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, Elaine. Great to see you all.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we'll continue our look into the need for migratory corridors for wildlife and what progress is being made or can be made. My guest will be Dr. William Newmark from the Natural History Museum of Utah in Salt Lake City. Dr. Newmark is the lead author of a recent paper looking at how Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks and Mount Rainier and North Cascades National Parks can be linked by migratory corridors. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.